We're focusing today on medicine, genetics, DNA, research, and careers in the life sciences. You know, science fiction of the Star Trek 1960s has become science fact, with many breakthroughs ahead of us in the future. But before we hear from our wonderful panelists, and I'm going to introduce them in a minute, before we do that, I'm very honored to introduce Nichelle Nichols' sister and the president of the Nichelle Nichols Foundation, Marion Smothers.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much again for being here. This is our fourth speak in the series, and I'm so excited to have you all here. I have learned so very much speaking with all of you during these series, and I look forward to hearing from each and every one of you and about your wonderful lives and all of the great things that you're doing out there. Nichelle influenced so very many people. I know when I attended some of the conferences with her, the conventions, I was just really shocked over the years to learn how many people said, you know, we looked at you and saw you, what you were doing, and they said, I want to be a doctor. I want to be a astronaut, you know, and she encouraged so many people. And so that's why we started the foundation in December of last year. We kicked it off, and we're just really happy to be here. We're trying to keep her legacy alive. We talked about it back 10, 15 years ago, and about her legacy and her foundation. And it's one of those things, you think you have so much time and you just put stuff off, you know. And so I wanted to definitely keep her legacy alive and honor her wishes. So the foundation was founded, like I said, last December. And we're fundraising right now, and we would encourage everyone to go to nichellenichols.foundation and please donate. We're raising funds to send young women between 13 and 18 to space camp, and we've customized the program to be Nichelle Nichols Space Cadet Camp. It's going to be in Huntsville, Alabama next year, June of 24. So we're working really hard trying to get sponsors to at least sponsor one girl or 5 girls or sponsor the whole thing. We're trying to send at least 20 girls the first time, but we'd like to send 100, you know, so that's very ambitious, and we're working towards it. And the speaker series really helps, and your contribution helps immensely. So thank you all for being here.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Marion. So I would like to introduce you now to our wonderful panelists in alphabetical order. Dr. Audrey Lin specializes in evolution and genomics. She is the George Birch. I'm reading this because it's really a wonderful, wonderful mouthful. I love it. She is the George Birch Postdoctoral Fellow in Theoretical Medicine and Affiliated Theoretical Science in the Department of Anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian. So if each of you could tell us more about yourselves and especially your connection to Star Trek, how it has influenced you. Audrey?
So yeah, thank you, Jayne, for the lovely introduction. I am a paleogeneticist, meaning that I study ancient DNA or sequenced DNA that had been isolated from archaeological remains like bone, teeth, or preserved soft tissue. And I study a couple of things. I study the evolution of domestic animals like dogs, how dogs have changed genetically as they have migrated with humans, different human populations around the world, and also how they have changed. How they have changed as they are especially bred to suit different functional needs by these different human populations. I also study the evolution of pathogens, specifically viruses. I am particularly interested in why certain viruses in their animal reservoir hosts infect new species and are able to adapt to infecting that new species. For example, how does an influenza virus in a duck end up causing a pandemic in humans? So I'm currently doing a project at the Smithsonian trying to recover influenza virus RNA from 150-year-old ducks that had been preserved in alcohol. I'm swabbing their butts, their cloacas, and their intestinal contents in full PPE inside of a dedicated ancient biomolecules facility at the Smithsonian. And the hope is by recovering this really old influenza virus RNA that predates the 1918 pandemic, we'll be able to learn more about the evolution of the viruses that have contributed to the 1918 pandemic influenza virus, how it became the way it is. And as for Star Trek, I remember watching The Next Generation when it was first airing, and I really enjoyed it. But I did not become a full-on Trekkie until I started watching the original series when I was a teenager. My favorite character is Spock. And when I was 16, I was incredibly shy, incredibly socially awkward, and I felt like an alien next to my peers. So I had really identified with Spock and his struggles with his half-human, half-Vulcan ancestry. I also found him aspirational. He was intelligent, skilled, incredibly knowledgeable, and he was respected by the crew for that. He was also respected for being different. And I also liked how on Star Trek, the crew were all highly skilled in different ways, and they all had different equally important roles on the ship. And I think that in the original series, there was less of this emphasis on a military style hierarchy with a stringent chain of command. And why would you need that on a scientific exploratory vessel? So anyway, that really appealed to me as well. I wanted to become a science officer like Spock.
I'm just fascinated listening to you and all those qualities that you said Spock had. I'm listening and I'm like, well, you do too. Really cool.
Thank you.
Very cool. So our next panelist to be introduced is Dr. Mohamed Noor, a personal friend, which is not his most important qualification here. He specializes in evolution and genetics, and later or now, I would love for you to explain to everybody the difference between genomics and genetics, which I looked up. And he is also, I am going to say, the interim vice provost for academic affairs at Duke and a contracted science consultant for Star Trek. So same thing, Mohamed, if you could tell us more about yourself and your connection.
Hold on, we've got technical problems. I can't hear anything.
Oh, I can hear you guys.
I can hear. I think we can all
hear
hear.
you, Norman. Did you mute yourself?
Looks like he logged off. I assume he'll come right back.
I hope our audience heard all of that introduction to Mohamed.
I heard it fine.
Norman will have to not hear what you have to say as he tries to log back up before I introduce him. So
Norman and I are old friends. He knows everything about what I do anyway. So
yeah, right. So
thank you for having.
Yeah.
Thank you for having. Thank you all for being here. I'll talk just a little bit about my research, and I'll talk a little bit about my teaching, because I think we're going to talk about outreach at a later question. But in terms of research, let me start with a fun fact. Most people that you know probably have a gene variant that would cause death before adulthood. And you might think like, well, wait a minute, but how is that possible? Because they're obviously alive, right? But the thing is, we get one copy of all our genes from our mom and one copy of all our genes from our dad. And the good thing is that we usually just have one broken copy rather than two. And the good copy covers the broken copy and makes it so you don't actually die. So the research that I'm doing in my laboratory right now is to try to understand, why are there so many mutations that cause premature death? Like, why are they so abundant? And this is true not just in humans, but in most animal species that have been studied. We call them lethal alleles, but they're basically these gene variants that cause death before adulthood. So I've collected, hundreds of wild fruit flies from my backyard here at home, brought them into the laboratory, and just, done a whole bunch of genetic analyses to try to figure out what are these mutations. And the great thing about working with fruit flies is you get rapid generations. You can get, generation in 2 weeks instead of 20 years. much better. We also have a lot of genetic tools with which to work with. So, I mean, they're great. And, so far it's working pretty well. There's one mutation that I found repeatedly in some flies, in a gene that's called DROSHA. And if you're wondering, like, well, what's the usefulness for this work? That particular gene is actually something that's associated with a common childhood kidney cancer in humans. So, there's potential implications for, medicine and things like that, too, in this research. Now, that's a heavy deep dive in terms of what my research lab is doing. Does it connect directly to Star Trek? Not so much. But, as a kid, I loved Star Trek from the time I was about 8. I think when I was first introduced to it. The original series had already aired before I was born, but I caught it in reruns and I immediately fell in love. And it became something that I used to bond with other people. I would find other people who liked Star Trek. And what I found fairly quickly is that people who like Star Trek also very often like science. Like if you poll scientists, I don't know if it's a vast majority, but a ton of them have watched some or all Star Trek and are big fans of Star Trek. And in fact, that was a way I got very close with my undergraduate advisor, who coincidentally was Dr. Johnson's undergraduate advisor too. But in college, I chat with him about Star Trek and I ended up doing research with him. And that's what got me into research, was doing that. And we still bond on it. I still hear from him every couple of weeks about, hey, did you see the news about the new Star Trek series? Like, yep, I did. Now I have, in terms of using Star Trek, although I don't use it in my research, I actually do use it in my teaching. I've taught a class here at Duke University that's literally called Genetics, Evolution, Star Trek, and that's the way it appears on student transcripts. But it's equivalent to the typical introductory genetics and evolution class that the majors take. This one is a non-majors class. But what I do is it's all using the same concepts, but framed in examples from various Star Trek episodes. So students have a narrative with which to understand it. Interestingly, half the students haven't seen any Star Trek, but they just really like this idea of having a cool narrative for understanding these concepts instead of just, here's a bunch of terms, here's a bunch of concepts, memorize them. Instead, there's a story. Let's follow the story. Oh, look, this is showing natural selection. Well, now let's talk about what natural selection is. Or, oh, look, this is showing another evolutionary process, like one called genetic drift. And, you get to understand it that way. So I've loved incorporating Star Trek into all facets of my life. I'll stop there.
Well, I had the good fortune of being a very temporary student in that class at Duke because I'm an alum. And when I met Mohamed, he said, will you come talk to my evolutionary biology class? Because I told him I was a biology major for a short time at Duke. And I always joke that I said to him, you understand that I'm an actress. But I did go. And it was delightful. And Mohamed did not mention that he himself, he wrote a book. Tell me the title again, Mohamed.
Sure. I'll grab it. It's right here too. Live Long and Evolve: What Star Trek Can Teach Us About Evolution, Genetics, and Life on Other Worlds.
Really great book.
Thank you.
I arrived with my copy heavily marked up with questions for Mohamed. And there's something that you mentioned, Mohamed, but if it comes up, if we have time to discuss afterwards about that, it's very interesting about those. You get one copy and the evolution. I have a question from another book I read. But
awesome.
Anyway, let me go on to introduce Dr. Norman Johnson, who specializes also in evolution and genetics, and Mohamed Noor, that you guys
we've known each other a long time.
Graduate school. You've known each other forever. But I'm reading this too. Dr. Johnson is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, is a science writer, and take it away. Tell us more about you and your work and your connection to Star Trek.
Okay, great. So I started out too with working with Drosophila fruit flies, looking at why different species of fruit flies could not interbreed. And this is something that Mohamed had done as well. And looking at the genetic basis of that. Worked a bit with flower beetles, continuing on with questions about speciation, how that happens. I've been moving into more about science writing. So I wanted to bring out those talents as well. And so I've written a couple of books on this. And the most recent book that I've written is Darwin's Reach, which is about how evolution principles and information can be used, can be applied for a number of different problems, such as in the COVID pandemic that we have had, other pandemics, other things about evolutionary medicine, including cancer, and I'm continuing work with cancer and evolutionary biology, talking about dogs, again, another thing that Audrey's talked about, looking at this from a broader perspective, looking about conservation biology, looking at even like cases of law and like how evolutionary biology matters in cases of law as well, like defendants are being convicted or exonerated based upon DNA patterns. And so I've been doing that, writing about this. As far as Star Trek goes, I was born in the same year as Star Trek, a couple of months before, and was listening to, and reading, watching the series. And this is before there was anything else. I mean, there was the animated series as well. So, I mean, I think I saw that first run. But this is before the movies. The movies came out when I was in high school. And I for similar reasons, I think that Audrey talked about, connected with Spock. Somebody who I felt like an outsider at different times. Connected with Spock and connected with the logic involved with that. And connected with the way the crew worked together and the exploration. It sort of like gave a hopeful view of the future. And, I think that it's true now. We feel like there's a lot of bad things going on in the world now. That was true in the 70s as well. And I think Star Trek gave a view of a future that would be better.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I'm excited to dive into this discussion. I'm dying to give, since you've introduced yourself and it's on my mind, I have been reading, coincidentally, a book made for civilians, written for civilians like me. I love Bill Bryson. I don't know if you guys.
Oh, yes.
I love him. But he wrote a book called The Body.
I quote that in my book.
A Guide for Occupants. I
Yes.
love it. And there's
Great book.
one, you guys were talking about cancer and evolution, but he had one interesting paragraph that that surprised me. And you may have a comment or not, because it might be too plebeian for you guys, but he was quoting somebody as saying cancer is the price we pay for evolution. If our cells couldn't mutate, we would never get cancer, but we also couldn't evolve. We would be fixed forever. What this means in practice is that although evolution is sometimes tough on the individual, it is beneficial for the species. I was very shocked having, members of my family and friends dealing with cancer at the moment. To read that paragraph was, I thought, oh, that's a different way of looking at evolution and the pros and cons. So
Yeah.
you guys were bringing it up, but without these mutations and without all of this, we wouldn't be evolving at all. So that's my little, I have that book marked up just like your book, Mohamed. So I have another, so the next question I have for you, you mentioned, Norman, the advances that have been taking place always, and you mentioned since the 70s, but since the 60s, there's been a lot of breakthroughs made. And can you tell us what you see happening in the next 5, 10, or 50 years? I know when we spoke before, you talked about how a disease like cystic fibrosis, which used to be a death sentence, really, now with all this work with genetics, it can be managed better. So tell us more, and we'll go from you, and then the other you can pipe in. Yeah.
So cystic fibrosis, as you just said, has become much more manageable thanks to better diagnosis and better treatment, but most particularly in terms of different drugs that have been developed because we know the genetic basis of that disease and we know how the proteins work. And so that's been done. And similarly, sickle cell anemia has been, we've been making a lot of progress with that as well. But those are cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia are both due to single genes. There are some modifiers there, but it's mostly due to single genes. And so those are the easy ones, relatively easy ones to do. But a lot of diseases are due to a lot, like coronary heart disease. It's due to a lot of different genes. And we're just now getting to the point of being able to tackle on these polygenic or multiple gene diseases. And a lot of things are being cancer is not a single factor. And so we can know more about what treatments to use for cancer based upon what particular alleles, what particular genetic variants, have changed in that cancer. And so we can actually make a diagnosis and treatment better, given what we know about the biology there.
It's brilliant. I mean, I have a friend dealing with AML at the moment, and the prognosis for that is so much better because of this genetic research, what can be done. It's amazing. So thank you. And I'm sort of going in backwards order here. Dr. Audrey, you deal with viruses. So, what do you see coming down the pike in the future?
Well, I do deal with viruses. I would actually like to talk a bit about how viruses relate to our genomes, and how the development of the next generation sequencing technologies within the last 15, 20 years have really facilitated our understanding of that. So the structure of DNA was discovered in the 1950s, right? And then after that, scientists had moved on to determining the sequence of genes. And then the development of genetic sequencing had, gone hand in hand with the study of viruses. We would not have progressed without studying viruses. The first genes sequenced in the 1970s were of bacteriophage genes. These are viruses that infect bacteria. And the first full genome sequenced in the 1980s was of an Epstein-Barr virus. So then a decade later, the Human Genome Project was created with the aim of sequencing all of the DNA in the human genome. And the hope at the time was that once we do this, we would be able to, find a cure for cancer, find the cure for all of these human diseases that are a bane to our existence, and also, reverse aging, like all of these wondrous things. So the first draft of the human genome was published in 2001, and it quickly became apparent that the more that we know about the human genome, the less that we know about it, right? It was, I imagine it was quite humbling, thousands of years of civilized thought had taught us that we were the most complex, most special biological organisms on the planet. And it turns out to maybe not be the case. We looked at, for example, we looked at the human genome and found that the genes that encode for protein only account for 1 to 2% of it. So what on earth could the other 98, 99% encode for? What does it do? This was thought of as this mysterious dark matter. We had no idea what it does, why it takes up so much space. So it was kind of dismissed as junk DNA, So anyway, it became clear after a few years that this was not junk DNA, but rather elements that regulate the expression of the protein coding genes. A lot of it does that. We're still not entirely sure what a lot of other things do, but this is only part of the picture, a big part of the picture. So these elements switch genes on and off at the right time so that you're operating, at a healthy state. And I diverted from viruses a bit. I'll come back to it now. We found out through genomic sequencing of the human genome that there are remnants of ancient retroviral infections that make up probably around 5% of your genome. I personally find it incredible that you have more virus ancestry than you have Neanderthal ancestry, which is only like 2%, right? And some of these ancient virus sequences in your genome helps you in a way, like for example, there's this syncytin gene that had been in which our ancestors had co-opted a retroviral gene to be used for the development of the placenta. And this function is so important that this actually occurred independently in other species. Well, it still blows my mind. As for breakthroughs, I think it's hard to make predictions because there's so many breakthroughs in science that are built upon basic science that generally doesn't have, specific applications, clinical applications in mind. Like, for example, John Gurdon in the 1950s, when he was a PhD student at Oxford, he was doing these weird experiments on frog embryos, and cloning frogs for the first time. Who knew that more than 60 years later, he would be awarded the Nobel Prize along with Shinya Yamanaka on pluripotent stem cell technologies, right? So I instead like to think about how there's more and more people now, young people from a diversity of backgrounds, people from groups who are underrepresented in science, who are replacing the old guard, so to speak. There's so much creativity that comes from a diversity of experiences, and I think that they're going to change the different scientific disciplines for the better, and they're also going to serve people for the better too. I think that science will be more community focused. There's a lot of communities that have been historically hurt by and marginalized by Western science, and like medicines and other therapies are not created equal. Some people, have access to treatments that others don't because of money. And I'd like to think that in less than 50 years from now, access to these treatments will be more equitable. So yeah, not scientific discoveries per se, but science will be created by and represented by a greater diversity of people who more closely reflect the rest of the people living on this planet that we all share together.
Oh, I love that. That's beautiful. Even though it's not a scientific.
And that's just part of the focus of what we're trying to do, get young people involved in the STEM process. And this is what our space camp next year is hoping to do. This is great. I'm loving this. Thank you.
Yeah, that was just great. And I learned the term from Bill Bryson's book, convergent evolution, when you talk about it happening. That's just wonderful.
Can I interject something about that Audrey said about, she mentioned phages. There's a lot of work that's being done right now about using phages to treat disease, because we've got antibiotics are wonderful, but the bacteria evolved to the antibiotics. So how do you deal with that? And so there's work being done now that uses phage, that uses this natural enemy of the bacteria. And the bacteria can evolve in response to the phage. But in doing so, in particular for like one particular phage, as the bacteria evolve to the phage, they become less resistant to the antibiotic. And this puts them at a double bind, that they can either adapt one way or they can adapt another way. And so if you use both the antibiotic and the phage, this particular phage, you can treat the disease. And this is being done for transplant, with persistent infection for that. Also for people with cystic fibrosis. And so this is one of the reasons why I think in the next few years, we're going to be seeing continued increases in the longevity and health of people with cystic fibrosis.
It's so fabulous. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Mohamed, do you have something that you'd like to?
I mean, those are fantastic answers from Drs. Johnson and Lin there. So it's hard to.
No, it's all contribution to a great conversation.
Yeah. Let me riff off of some points that Dr. Lin mentioned too in the context of basic science. So when we talk about basic science, we're talking about research that is not devoted specifically to curing cancer or curing cystic fibrosis or something like that. So let me give you two stories just along those lines, just as other illustrations. Dr. Lin gave the one in terms of the frog development as well. If you go back to the mid-1960s, around the time the original series of Star Trek was actually airing, there was a professor and this professor's student were studying these bacteria that live in hot springs. And they found one. It was interesting. This bacteria, you know where I'm going, Dr. Johnson. They found this bacteria that could live and survive and reproduce at 79 degrees Celsius. So that's like 175 degrees Fahrenheit. That's really, really, really hot. So they were really interested in this bacteria, like, oh, like it must, how do its enzymes not completely fall apart? And specifically, what the student ended up following up on is the enzyme that bacteria uses to copy its DNA as it's replicating. It had an unusual structure in that regard. Well, about 15 years after that, there was a Nobel Prize associated with this. That particular enzyme is the basis for the most widely used genetic reaction most widely used reaction in all of molecular biology. It's called, you've probably heard of this, the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. A lot of people have heard this recently in the context of this PCR tests for COVID-19 and things like that. But it's the basis for everything in genetic engineering, everything in forensics, all sorts of genetic tests of health, everything all came from that random finding of this bacteria that happens to live in a hot spring. Completely revolutionized. Like we wouldn't have had a genome project at the same timing. Without that. So that's just amazing, and that's something that's happened in the past. Now let me jump forward. I'm going to give you another example that's a little bit more recent, and we haven't gotten the full impact yet but people are crossing their fingers hard. In the mid-1990s, there was a friend of ours, actually, of Dr. Johnson and I, who was at the University of California, Davis, was studying this other bacteria that is an intracellular parasite. It lives inside the cells of like half of the insect species out there, or more than half the insect species out there. And for some of these, what it does is it creates this weird dynamic for the insect hosts. Well, actually, I should mention, first of all, these bacteria are passed on by the insects from their mothers to their offspring. Okay, so every kid gets it from their mom if the mom was infected. But there's this interesting dynamic that if an uninfected female mates with an infected male, okay, if an uninfected female mates with an infected male, she produces no offspring at all. So it's this weird dynamic where it's actually better for females to be infected with this bacteria than uninfected, because then they can mate with anybody and they always produce offspring, right? So it's an interesting evolutionary dynamic. What happens with this then, as soon as it gets into an insect species, it spreads really fast because there's this benefit to being infected, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So fast forward another decade and a half, and this is what's now the part that's in progress. Turns out, if these insects are infected with this particular bacteria, which is pretty harmless to everybody else, it's called Wolbachia, they actually often don't transmit other diseases. So if you insert this bacteria into mosquitoes, they cannot or are transmitted at much lower degree things like dengue fever. So what people have been doing is they've been actually introducing this into mosquito populations. And when you introduce it, it spreads because of this female advantage really fast. Like in under a year, it'll completely take over the population. And those insects now no longer pass on dengue. So there's these massive eradication efforts for dengue going on using this bacteria that's been discovered just through an interesting evolutionary dynamic that could potentially eradicate dengue fever. Like, that's amazing. If you want to read more about it, there's a whole organization working on this. If you just go to worldmosquitoprogram.org. So I'll say again, worldmosquitoprogram.org. There's a whole thing about that shows all the places they're using. They're introducing it in Vietnam. They're introducing it in Central America. This just came out of this random evolutionary study, and it could save, 1 billion people on the planet. So go basic science.
And to continue on that, it's not just for dengue. This can be used in a lot of different ways for pest control. It's a lot like the old sterile insect technique. but it's got a wide application. It can be used in so many different things.
Yeah.
And this is Wolbachia, by the way.
Yep. And then
Wolbachia is the name of the bacteria.
Yeah. But anyway, this is just really exciting in terms of what may come from this.
Yeah.
I mean,
no, but as I listen to you, I'm just thinking if any young people are listening to you, it just makes it so exciting what you're talking about and how very cool it is, you know. So it's wonderful to have panels like this so that young minds can get excited about what a contribution they can make, and discovering these random strange things like a bacteria in a hot spring or the frog, you know, like studying the placentas, you know. But so interesting. And that does lead me to the third question is, what advice do you all have for younger people who want to pursue a career in life sciences? And what outreach do you currently do, if any? I mean, you're all very busy to inspire the next generation. So we'll go back to the original order. And Dr. Lin, tell us.
I would like to say that that stereotypically, like when you think of scientists and in their labs and practicing science, you may think that they are these hyper competitive, isolated, like lone wolves in the lab. And it really is not like that. Science is collaborative. Like your discoveries would not have been made possible if your research was not built upon the decades of research that others have done. Like you are, as you know, the saying goes, standing on the shoulder of giants, and you get so much further working, cooperating, and collaborating with others than you do like trying to go at it like yourself. In my field of ancient DNA, yes, I work with other biologists and geneticists, but I also work with chemists, statisticians, computer scientists, archaeologists, cultural anthropologists, historians, museum curators, and artists as well. And research, you know, it like, not gonna lie, it is not easy, but it is also it's so much fun. I personally get a lot of fulfillment knowing that what I do is contributing to the broader, you know, body of human knowledge. And like a lot of people in research are, you know, neurodivergent, socially awkward, weirdos, and I'm also a neurodivergent, socially awkward weirdo. So there's a lot of freedom in embracing that, and that you're with a bunch of like-minded people, you know, nerds who are interested in similar things and also share this common goal of feeling fulfillment in contributing to you know, the body of human knowledge. So it's interesting, you know, speaking to young people who are interested in life sciences, because to be honest, when I was a child, I wasn't all that interested in science. I was interested in writing, you know, in stories, history, art. I preferred sitting at home and reading books rather than, you know, going outside and getting dirty, investigating the natural world. And math, you know, never came naturally to me, and it still doesn't. But I loved Star Trek and science fiction, and Spock, you know, was my personal hero. And as a young person, I suppose I identified with Spock in spirit. I found him aspirational, but like at the time, I didn't feel like I had the intellectual, the cognitive capabilities to be Spock. Like, how could I ever be such a brilliant science officer like Spock? And this is low self-confidence, you know, low self-esteem. And so when I graduated high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just worked for a few years before going back to school. I had started at a community college in Las Vegas, and I had only began studying the life sciences, biology as an adult, taking all of these difficult science and math classes, pushing myself through it with the intention of getting a clinical laboratory sciences bachelor's degree. Well, when I was one class away from becoming eligible for this program, my university announced their drastic budget cuts and cut that program. So I then was like, okay, I switched to a general biological sciences degree. And then it was kind of a blessing because I was able to take these upper division classes that I would not have been able to take before, if I had then done the clinical laboratory sciences degree. I took microbiology, microbial ecology, bioarchaeology, evolutionary medicine, forensic anthropology. And so it was like from taking all of these other classes that I learned that there were areas of research that reminded me of being a kid. It was like reading science fiction, watching science fiction, and I loved it. Bacteria talking to each other and informing collective unit to eat their prey. Viruses so big that they have their own viruses. And we even know what intestinal parasites that King Richard III of England had when he died, So amazing. So I guess the point of my story, and I'm talking to young people as well as older people who are young at heart. You can have careers in life sciences as your third careers. Life does not move in a straight line, and if you are genuinely interested in the science, you are never too old to learn. Plainly speaking, academic environment is harder if you are, a first generation student, or if you're part of an underrepresented minority group. But if you don't have family members to help you navigate how things work at college, how to deal with the administrative paperwork and deadlines, the social protocols on how to interact with your professors and the other students, it's so overwhelming and it's confusing and it's so easy to become discouraged. Do not become discouraged. Find a mentor who will advise you. If you are genuinely interested in the material that a professor is teaching in a class, do not be shy to reach out. Ask questions. Go to their office hours. They will recognize that you are serious about being there, and they will try to help you. And also, second, if you have even if you have the most supportive mentors, and I was very, very lucky to have them. I love them. Remember that you are your own greatest champion. You have to believe in yourself and your abilities. And I know that this is the hardest thing to do. The world is difficult and is a dumpster fire. And women, a lot of women of color are socialized to be differential to others, to be more doubtful in your abilities and your intelligence, to be more self-critical. You're socialized to make yourself small, to take up less space. Well, there are so many people who will try to tear you down and try to diminish you and your accomplishments. And you can't let them do that. You have to be stubborn. Do not be so hard on yourself that you tear yourself down, and do the job for them. Okay. Do not compromise who you are to try to fit yourself into a mold dictated by some, jackass who doesn't know what they're talking about. Be unapologetically you. Take inspiration from Nichols, who had achieved so much and did not take any BS from anyone. I believe in you. Okay. I believe in you. I'm done.
So thank you so much. I get a tear in my eye because you explain, don't think you have to do it on a certain path at a certain time. It's wonderful that you told us that you would read books and you thought, interested in art, which is also extremely valid, but that you thought, oh, I don't have the goods, and then followed what you were so fascinated by, but not on the trajectory. But I would like to also emphasize your thing about a professor, and Mohamed and Norman, you can back me up on this, or back Audrey up on this, that professors love when a truly interested student appears in front of them.
Yes. Why
else are they there? So when a truly engaged student is like, can you help me? So take it away. And Mohamed, you're next.
Actually, I was going to toss back to Dr. Lin. I don't know if you answered the second half of the question, which is what are things you do?
Sorry.
Yeah, that's good.
So the outreach. Yeah. I mean, I do this sort of things. I like talking to other fellow like Trekkies and young people who are interested in science and in genetics and in dogs and viruses. I'm very happy in contributing to their projects. It's one of the best parts of being where I am, and it also pulls me out of like this fog that I get into if I'm working too hard. It gives me perspective, and it in knowing that what I do actually like means something to people. So yeah, I do things online like this. I do things in person. I'm available if you're like in elementary, middle school, high school, if you want to interview me for your projects, like just reach out. I'm here.
Awesome. Thanks. Sorry for tossing it back to you. I just want to make sure that you put that
in there.
That's
great.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Dr. Lin said, that 100-fold over. I mean, the first thing I would tell people is like, don't be afraid to be aggressively curious. And I don't mean like in a mean way, but just, don't be shy about your curiosity. If you're interested in something, read up as much as you can about the subject, read online if you can, get access to the books from the library or whatever, read as much as you can, reach out to professors about it. If you hear about a cool research study, see if you can actually get that research study. If there's aspects that you don't understand, try first just Google just to see if it's something really basic. And if it's something that you can't find easily by Google, reach out to the professor or reach out to the graduate student or the postdoc or whoever did the research. Very often people are very flattered that somebody cares about their research. It's not the usual 7 people who are usually reading our papers, but it's going outside. So you'll very often get an enthusiastic response. Or especially if it's a simple question, they'll just be like, "Oh yeah, I'm happy to explain to you. This is how this works," or something like that. So yeah, and everything that Professor Lin said about mentoring is incredibly important there too. Get what you need, find the mentors you need. You may be, let's say you're in high school or your college, you're assigned a guidance counselor, you're assigned an advisor. If you're not getting what you need from them, find one on your own. Just reach out and ask people, "Hey, do you mind if I ask you some questions? Do you mind if I ask your advice?" And you evaluate that advice. Sometimes advice won't be great. Evaluate it, from to the best of your ability, and then make a decision based on those sorts of things. If you're really interested in, say, the research part, which I know we talked about that a lot at the beginning of this podcast, if you're interested in the research part, if you can find an opportunity to do research, that opens up a lot of doors. It's really wonderful for helping you understand a project, for helping you appreciate it, and for being a part of this process of science, actually directly contributing to it. A nice thing that's happening there's a change I think that's been happening in the field over the last 20 years now. It's less common now and this connects to something Dr. Lin said earlier, it's less common now for professors or whomever to take on quote unquote volunteers. And that sounds bad, but on the other hand, that's actually a good thing, because what was happening is, of course, if you're taking on volunteers, who has the privilege to be able to go and volunteer their time and not be paid and not get course credit? It tends to be, people from very affluent families, people who have a lot of means and things like that. So now there's a move to not do that as much, but instead to always make sure that the people who are working on research get some sort of compensation. Either they're getting course credit towards their major, which is great, or they're getting, actual pay. And, the pay rates are pretty good. They're well above minimum wage. So, you could work on doing research to get the salary. You could work, retail, so, whichever you prefer. So if you can get that experience, it helps a lot. It helps you really understand what's going on there. I don't want to belabor the advice piece, because I think everything Dr. Lin said, so I don't want to just rehash everything she said again. In terms of what I do in this context, I mean, I love, as Dr. Lin said, I love giving talks at conventions, on podcasts like this, at other sorts of events. One thing I've been doing is, as Jayne mentioned at the very beginning, that I do consulting for the Star Trek series. So one of the things that I'm very impressed with Star Trek in general, this has been true throughout Star Trek, all the way from the original series through the modern day. They really want to, as much as possible, get the science right. And the fact that they reach out to scientists like me, I should mention, by the way, that science consultant for the entire Star Trek universe is Dr. Aaron McDonald. And then beyond that, if they need other expertise, they might reach out to somebody like me or somebody else for a contract. So that's what it means when we say a contracted science consultant. So yeah, I mean, the fact that they're reaching out to science and trying to get the science as well as possible. Story will always trump science, but these are the stories that inspire people to go into STEM. I mean, I heard in various interviews with Nichelle and various other of the actors that, they often saw this, this person on screen doing this really exciting stuff. Like, I want to be like that person. They get excited. They wanted to do science, engineering, math, or whatever. So it's wonderful that they give us the opportunity to contribute to that, to help hopefully inspire more people to go into the field.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And Norman, how about
Mohamed and Audrey have said a lot of what I wanted to say, so I'm just going to elaborate on that. The federal government, through various agencies such as the NSF, the National Science Foundation, has awards for undergraduate research. And there are lots of acronyms there. I'm not going to bother you with all of those but they have lots of different, REUs is one of them, a lot of different ones at different universities that you can go to. If you're in, say, Los Angeles, you could go to one in North Carolina or one in Washington, D.C., or one in anywhere. And these are things that are, they're out there. You'll have to do some checking about that. But they're out there, and so take advantage of those opportunities. Take advantage of the mentorships, and I wish there were a better repository for these. Mohamed, you may know. Are there any repositories for such fellowships?
For just undergraduate fellowships in general?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it's the kind of thing, I'm sure if you Google, you'll find at least some lists. I don't know if a good centralized one's a good question.
Yeah, it's not centralized. So you'll have to look. You'll have to hunt around. But to look out for those. And it may not be in the exact area that you want to look into, but it's still an opportunity. And you should try to take advantage of it. And there are various high school programs as well. Take advantage of that. Take advantage of all that you can find. And keep an open mind. So there are a lot of things that you're not going to see what the immediate relevance of, let's say, linear algebra. You may not see what the immediate relevance of linear algebra is at some point. But there's a lot of evolutionary biology that's built upon the principles of linear algebras. Mohamed would know as well. So those are two things. Look for those opportunities and keep an open mind. As far as what I've done in outreach, a lot of it has been involved with working with teachers. So I've done a lot of work with teacher workshops and getting together with teachers. I ran a program, a working group at the National Center for Science Education, the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, and have been involved with people from the National Center for Science Education. I've also been working together with medical doctors and medical researchers and trying to bring in evolutionary biology to that, because a lot of doctors don't really work with that. But I think that those principles are very valuable to evolution and to human health. Are valuable to human health and medicine. So, yeah.
Can I add one quick thing I forgot earlier?
Yes.
There's one other principle I think is very important, and actually the folks here exemplify it very well. For getting ahead in science, and this, I don't think this was true as much 30 years ago, but it's very true now. So much of science now is so collaborative that if you want to do a lot of good science, honestly, just being nice to people is actually a huge way to make sure you get ahead.
There's so many times it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, that was not true 30 years ago. But now, like the number of opportunities that people will just like reach out and be like, "Hey, I saw you were doing blah. I happen to have something that's useful. Here you go." But wow, that's great. Or vice versa. So if you do this often, essentially the scientific community always has worked pretty well together. But I think that seamlessness of collaboration has gotten a lot stronger with a lot of the recent projects. So again, being a good human being and a good collaborator and cooperator with other folks is a big plus. And it's also just the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think whatever you're going into in life, that's a good thing. Yeah, it's true. Would any of you like to add anything that you think that we didn't cover in terms of what you see coming or what you do or something about Star Trek or anything? This has been such a great conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's coming is a lot of different work that is interdisciplinary. I think is coming. I think we've started, we've hemmed upon it, but I think a lot of principles from, say, evolutionary medicine may be applied to conservation biology and vice versa. And I think, or even to different social problems. Like I'm collaborating right now on a project about how to apply lessons learned about resistance in biology to resistance in social movements and stuff like that. And so, and this comes back to in Star Trek with resistance is futile, or maybe it's not.
You know, that kind of goes back to what Dr. Lin was talking about. You know, you stand on the shoulders of the people before you, but you also have to stand together with all the people around you. Nobody can do it alone. And I think that especially the message in the West has been this sort of weird message of the guy who does it all by himself. And, you know, or I think it's a great message to remind, especially the young people, you really end up not being able to do anything completely by yourself.
And that guy didn't do it all by himself anyway. He just got all the credit for it.
I was going to say the same thing.
No, that's exactly right. We had a funny story. I don't know if somebody, my husband came home from something and someone was being kind of braggy about what they had done all on their own. And I said, really, did he change his own diapers when he was born? Did he feed himself? Did he take himself to school? Did he make a lunch for himself? Really? Did he wash his clothes? I brought up all the mom things, but, I was like, come on. No, he didn't. So nobody does it alone. But this has been such a great, I've been so sparked by what everybody is saying. I'm going to pass it back to Nichelle's sister. And if with any kind of closing remarks about the foundation or anything that you'd like to say.
This has been so overwhelming for me and just really so informative. And I know one of the first things I'm going to do is go on YouTube and look at the whole thing all over again, But I think each one of you have just contributed so much. And I think this is great. I love the series that we're doing because it brings what you're doing to the masses, the people that are interested and that can grow from this. And even myself, I can grow from what I'm listening to from you. And I just want to real quick make just shout out. I meant to shout this out before we all got started, is that our next speaker series will be on May 20th. And we're going to spotlight on Walter Koenig, and he's going to talk about his relationship over all of these many years with Nichelle Nichols. Thank you all. I just love this. Thank you.
That's just so great. And make sure to go to the Nichelle Nichols Foundation for more information. And you can share this speaker series as well. Thank you.
Go and donate. Thank you. Thank you.
For having us. It was fun. Thanks to the folks in chat too.
Thank you.